Hello everyone, welcome today to Fake Food Props. My name is Eric Barnes, I'm a props master in St. Louis, and today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite areas in the world of props, which is the idea of fake food and food-related props. So, I'm sure that most of you guys have done shows at your school where you've needed some version of food on stage, and today we're going to talk about sort of the three different ways that you can kind of achieve that look. The first one we're going to start with is to try and trick the mind entirely and not provide any actual food on there by using items that are the wrappers of food. So in this case, this Coke can is a vintage Coke can. But this on stage, if somebody was lifting it to their mouth and drinking, you would have no way of knowing that there wasn't actually soda in it. One of my favorite ways of faking foods like this is to use, especially in the vintage world, different labels. So these are three labels that I made, and any one of them I could wrap around this modern can and give me not only the look of a different item, but also, depending on what era the show is set in, perhaps an appropriate vintage look, right? Now, there are a couple of ways of achieving these sort of labels. One is that there are some images online that you can print off that are fairly decent quality. Obviously, too, there's a lot of things that you can find on eBay and stuff if there's a specific brand mentioned or a specific type of food that's not very common. But the way that I do most of mine, honestly, is with this book. It's called Label Art by Dover Pictora. And the thing that I really like about this book, in fact, all three of these labels that you see here came from this collection, is that what it is it is a royalty-free series of images that you can use for any prop needs you have. And they have a bunch of things. Like, these are all different cheese labels. These are different, like, drink, soda, root beer, birch beer, that kind of stuff. All the way into sort of, like, medical poisonings and, you know, different sort of apothecary kind of style labels. And what's nice about this collection is that it also comes with a CD-ROM, which I know is becoming antiquated at this point in time, but it does give you all of the photos already digitized, so you can really print them and scale them to whatever size you need. In fact, this one here that I've scaled for our can size is actually meant to be a crate label for 28 pounds of apples. So you can imagine that this label was not this size when it was originally used. But it's a really good sort of thing to add to your props library at your school because, again, it creates such a wide variety of options for you. And then along the same lines of that is, as our Coke can was, and as is this butter wrapper, using objects, using wrappers that are real, but putting something inside of them that is safe to keep on stage, doesn't need to be kept refrigerated. So in this case, normally what I use a lot are these sponges because they're really cheap and they're really easy to cut down to whatever size I need. And I find they work really well to fill out things like this. And it gives you the look. This one obviously has been through a whole show, so it's a bit raggedy. But it gives you that sort of look and feel of something that the actors can manipulate in a realistic way, but I don't have to worry about it melting on stage on them. If I need to do something where the actor is holding something, I may have to go so far as to make a mold. And so in this case, I made a mold of butter. Because we had some pads that needed to be sitting out on the table. And again, not that they ate, but just that we're supposed to look as if they could. And so I made two different shapes to kind of give me some variety of little butter squares. And these are, in fact, those molds, right? Right now they're cast in white plastic just because that's how I store all of my molds. I store them with white plastic in there to keep the mold from deforming as it sits on the shelf over time and for archival reasons. Plus that way, in case something were to happen to this, I have a fair number of the positives that I can make a new mold out of. That's that mold. And this is our little butter mold. So that's kind of the general version of what we're going to be discussing in this class. How we can fake things, how we can modify real things, and some tricks and techniques that might help you make better products for your food needs at your school. So one of my favorite items to use for making fake prop food is this stuff called Great Stuff. It's available at the local Home Depot and Lowe's and those kind of stores. And what it originally is meant for is to sort of fill the gaps in houses or around doors, around windows, things like that. But it makes for a really cheap and easy way of making a foam, because what you'll find when working with fake foods is that most of the things we eat are some version of foam in their texture. Things like bread or even vegetables and things like that, if they have kind of a rough foam-ish surface, they tend to look more realistic than like a solid chunk of something. And so this is really good at making things like any baked goods or cupcakes, things like that. And what it is it's basically a fancy version of glue that's stored under pressure in this can, and so you shake it up, and then after you shake it up, it will extrude itself out and kind of foam up as it goes. Now, this is a glue, so you want to make sure that you're always wearing gloves and don't touch it because it is very sticky. I always put down wax paper because I find it releases best from wax paper. But you want to make sure you're not putting it into anything that you care about, because this will glue itself permanently to whatever that is, unless it's on something like wax paper or something that's got a non-stick surface. So I've already shaken this can up, and the way that it functions is it has this nozzle here. Again, like I said, this can is stored under pressure, and so by tipping the nozzle at the end, you get an extrusion of the foam. And now this will keep expanding as it goes. And so this will kind of round itself out over a little while. And so if I were to make something more in this kind of a world, it's good for replicating things like donuts or eclairs, things like that. You can also make sort of like circular shapes with it. If you need to rough up a bunch of donuts or bagels, you can do that too. But the thing that I find that it's really best for are two things. The first of which are making, I always, because the other thing about this is that once you've opened a can, you kind of can't really save it. It kind of goes bad. And so I will often find myself having used a little bit of a can on a project. And so I will then at the end go ahead and make really thin streams of this foam, trying to actually not get much air out, but kind of like almost pulling it out, and then just kind of letting it flow, kind of stretching. And then so after these have finished their curing phase and finished their expanding process, you're left with these kind of pieces. And what I find these are really good for is either painted up to look like breadsticks in sort of like a vase or something on a table at a restaurant, or the one that I've used most often is just using a little bit of a dry brush green acrylic paint mix, turning them into really easy, fast, fake green beans when you need like a big bowl of green beans. I also have made version before for different shows that needed like fake Cheetos. And so I've also made Cheetos. But the thing that I really like, the reason why I really like these for green beans is because this texture actually allows you to still snap them in the same way that you would if you were actually like shucking green beans. And so it looks really convincing on stage, and is really kind of fun. And as I said, this entire can of great stuff I think was like less than $5, probably $3-ish, $4-ish. And so you can make a whole lot of them very, very cheaply and very, very efficiently. The other thing I do with it a lot is make fake cupcakes or use it as sort of the coating for like fake cakes. Now, great stuff is, obviously I said, meant to be sort of a gap filler around doors and things. And so really, I find that you don't want to go much more than about an inch, inch and a half in terms of your thickness, because if you do that, then it takes a long time for the center to dry, and sometimes it will collapse on you. So if I'm doing like a big fake cake and I want like a big rough frosted surface, I will make the center out of like insulation styrofoam, that either hard pink or hard blue foam, as the big rounds, and then use this in the same way that you just saw me sort of squeeze it out in like an eclair form just over that whole surface. The other thing it's really good for in sort of a similar way is over a muslin cover on the form of a tree, because it gives a fairly decent bark effect. But again, it's very, very cheap and very, very efficient. So, like I said, what I use this for mostly is cupcakes. And there's a couple of reasons. One, it's the cheapest expanding foam that is available. And two, it's actually very lightweight for its volume. And that works well for making like dance props of fake food, fake cupcakes, fake, trays of whatever they're supposed to be. And so when you are working with it, there are a couple of tricks to making the best cupcakes you can. Obviously, I always use a cupcake pan, and I always put a liner in. As I said, this is a glue, and so I don't want to have it like glued to the surface of my pan, because then I can never reuse the pan. It also is incredibly light, and so you're going to need to attach down your cupcake liners in some way to the pan itself temporarily, so that it holds that down while it's expanding. The easiest one is just to take like a roll of blue tape or packing tape and roll it and press it into the bottom. That's what I've done with this liner here. I've done the same thing on this liner here, but I've also cut out the bottom of a plastic cup. This does kind of just help give it a little flatter surface. As I said, as these rise, you can see how they kind of bulb out. And so if you don't have something there on the bottom, sometimes you have a tendency for them to get quite rounded. So if you're going to attach a finished thing back down to a tray of some sort, or have them in a basket or something, that's not a huge problem. But if you want it to sit proper, it's going to become a weeble that wobbles. So by putting that little couplet top in there, or putting a piece of cardstock or anything there, it does give it kind of a flatter finish. Or the third way, and the way that I do most often, especially when I'm making dance props, is I hide one of these cheap, big, what I call craft magnets in the bottom. And because what that allows me to do is it allows me to actually literally magnet the cake onto the tray. And then so no matter what way it's going, it won't fall off of the metal tray that the dancers are dancing with. So these cupcakes are in two different stages. So I'm going to show you guys first this stage, which fills it up to about this level. And then on this one, I'm going to go ahead and do this, which is the second coat. Again, you can kind of see, I've done this one so that you can kind of see the difference. That was the first layer in there, and then I did the second one around to give it a more realistic cupcakey shape. Again, because if I just did this, filled all this way up, it would just bulb out, and I would just end up with one big round thing. What I'm trying to get is sort of a cupcakey finish. So, this is definitely something that you'll get used to over time, but when you're starting out, you kind of always want to start out smaller than you think. To get that sort of level of fullness, I'm really only going to fill this about a third full. So, and again, I'm trying to move as much as I can sort of around to fill up as evenly as possible. And the other thing that I'm going to be really honest with you guys about when working with these, especially in this cupcake world, is that you're going to make a lot of bad ones. One of the reasons why I like this product is because it is so cheap, it is fun to play with, and you can just kind of experiment and make messes with it. So know that, like, if you need to make, I always plan on having a third that I like, a third that are passable, and then a third that I just would never use on stage. So if I need to make 12 cupcakes, I'll often make 36 or slightly more, just to kind of make sure I have enough to play with, to be totally honest. And this is sort of a slightly, it's the kind of product that kind of has a mind of its own in certain aspects. And so it kind of just does what it wants to do. And sometimes you can use that to great effect, like you can with making the grape beans and stuff. And sometimes you just have bad days with it where it just does not want to cooperate for some reason. So I'm going to let those guys rise, and we'll come back to them just to kind of show you what they look like at the end of class once they've risen up. But this one is one I did last night, so it's had all of its time to dry. And you can see it's dry all the way through. And so in the same way, what I want to do with this is just to try and achieve a slightly more realistic cupcake look by going around the cupcake itself. And this is one of those cases where you kind of want to move quickly with purpose. So. And now we will let those guys dry and come back to them at the end of the class. And one of my favorite things to do is to use shellac to reverse paint the inside of beer goblets to make them look as if they are full. I always put a piece of masking tape inside to give me this starting line, basically, and then I wrap the top edge in these tabs because I don't want to have any of the shellac dripping down. And so that gives me a pretty effective look. And so now that I have my tape off, you can see that I have kind of that illusion going. And if I do have any little places here, like where some dripped on, I can very easily go back through with just an X-Acto blade or a little bit of alcohol and swipe and kind of melt it off and get that back. So reverse painting is really efficient, especially if you need to fill bottles with things or have things that are sitting far away. It's not the most convincing up close because, again, as you can see in this case, we have an open surface. And so if you were using this downstage, you would sometimes be able to see inside of it, even if you were doing an opaque paint treatment on this kind of a glass to make it look like a milkshake. And so that is one other place where our great stuff really comes in handy. So if I was doing a milkshake version, I could basically reverse paint the back of this glass, put a straw into it, and then fill my cup up with the great stuff itself. Or in this case, because I'm trying to make it look more like a beer stein, I've gone ahead and squeezed out sort of a round puff of our great stuff and let this one dry. And now I can go back through and use the top of our cup to basically mark out where I need to trim, and then trim this down and create sort of a plug that will fit into our glass itself to help sell the illusion. This is also kind of a great way of showing you the inside of great stuff. It has sort of a uneven, foamy consistency to it. There you go. See, it helps sort of sell the illusion and helps fill in your reverse painted glass to look a little more realistic. The final category of things I want to talk about today is the use of silicone molds and liquid plastics for fake food making. It's something that I do a lot with my professional work because a lot of the operas and shows I'm doing have to get stored for a long period of time after the show runs, or they have very long runs, and so I need to make sure that either the items can be reproduced fairly efficiently or that they have a very long stable storage phase. And so I tend to make a lot of my own custom molds, mostly because some of the stuff I need is just not available off the shelf. So for example, this is a mold that I made for an opera where they needed to do raw chicken breasts on stage and handle them, and obviously they can't do that safely with any version of real chicken. And so we had to make custom molds to make then a whole series of silicone fake chicken breasts. So some of my molds are custom made, but a lot of molds, especially with the food world, I can do off-the-shelf molds, especially in the world of chocolates or cakes. So this is a silicone mold that I use a lot for making like fake little mini bundt cakes. And then this is a mold that I use a lot to make chocolates in. And what I'll do a lot for shows where there are some pieces that are edible and some pieces that are not is I will buy two of the exact same mold. And so I have one that I'll mark as food safe and one that I'll mark as for plastic. And then I'll pick one of the patterns. Maybe in this case I'll pick the stars. And those shapes will be the ones that are always edible. And then the other shapes I make in plastic so the actors know exactly which ones to grab. And there's no confusion about which ones are edible or not edible. So when casting with plastics, there are sort of two versions of plastic that you need to kind of consider. And they are foam and what I call solids. And so the difference is fairly straightforward. Basically what happens is the big difference between them is whether they foam up or they stay solid. And the reason that matters is because the texture matters immensely to what you're trying to sell on stage. So these are fake ice cream cones and scoops that I made for an opera. And as you can see, these are both effectively exactly the same. It's sort of a beige base with a brown swirl in it. But this one is made out of a foaming plastic, and this one is made out of a solid plastic. And because of the texture that we're used to seeing on ice cream, the solid plastic gives us a much more realistic finish than the foaming one does. right? Conversely, if we were talking about making a cupcake or making a bundt cake or things like that, this would be a much more convincing surface than something that was this shiny and solid, right? If we saw a bundt cake come out this color and texture, we would think something was weird. Also, practical matter, this is considerably heavier than this is. I mean, there's not a good way of showing you this on camera, but basically you can tell that that one is very, very lightweight and this one kind of thuds. Conversely, these are some fake chocolates that I've made over the years for different productions and needs and things. And you can see that, again, these have a very realistic finish because they have that solid plastic finish to them. And if they were made out of something foamy, they would seem less realistic. The other thing that I will do if I'm trying to make a specific mold of something is that this is actually a real roll that I dried out in the oven and poked holes in the bottom of, and then sealed in with liquid plastic to kind of create a plasticized roll that either then I can use on stage or I can make my own custom mold out of it. So then once I have this plastic copy, I can attach this to a box and then pour my own custom silicone mold and create my own replica rolls, basically. Now this one is in white plastic because that's what I always store my molds filled with, just to keep them from deforming as they sit on the shelf in what I call archive. But obviously I can paint them in any way that I want. And so we're going to start off today with some foam, some liquid foam. Today we're going to be using Smooth On's Flex Foam 3. And so if you ever are working with the Smooth On foams, the number 3 after it is a description of how lightweight it will be. So Flex Foam at 3 means that a 1 cubic foot by 1 cubic foot block would weigh 3 pounds. So you can imagine if Flex Foam at 3 versus Flex Foam at 25, 25 is going to weigh considerably more. And these all have slightly different volumes that you fill them to. This one happens to be 2 parts of B to 1 part of A. So for those of you that have not been to my classes before, I like to use little plastic measuring cups, and since most of these are based on a volumetric measurement, rather than measuring out a cup of something, if I fill the 2 cups to the same level, I know that they have the same volume, and so therefore they are the most accurate they can be. In this case, because of what I'm working with, I'm going to use these measuring cups that actually have some measurements on them and fill one to double the line of the other. Now, in case you haven't been to one of my classes before where we talked about either liquid plastics or silicones, there are 2 numbers that are on each version of silicone or liquid plastic that you might be working with. One is called the pot life and one is called the demold or cure time. And so you want to make sure you pay attention to those numbers because that will help you figure out how much time you have to work with it. In this case, I've only got about 35 seconds between when these 2 things mix to when they are starting their cure phase. And so that means I have to work very, very quickly. And again, because my pot life is so short on these, I always want to make sure I mix in my colorant first to one of the parts so that I don't waste any of my pot life in the mixing phase of trying to get this dye to incorporate. So this is 1 drop of the brown color. You always want to make sure you use the right kind of dyes with these things because if you use one that has too much water in it, it will cause it to foam unreliably and it will be a big mess. And you can see it's already starting to make bubbles. So I need to get this poured quickly, or I'm going to run out of my time before it goes off. So I'm going to only fill these very minimally. Because again, basically the bigger the number, the less it will actually expand. So for example, Flex Foam at 17 expands considerably less than Flex Foam at 3 does. Again, because it's trying to keep higher density and such, so that's why it weighs more. So these ones will expand fairly dramatically. And even in the time that I've been talking, you can see how much this one has already started to expand and started to bubble up. You can also see that in our molds, how it's kind of lightening up a little bit. This is that post-pot life phase, right? It's still liquid, it's not set up, but if I was to try and pour this in, or stir this anymore, I would actually start breaking down the bubbles, and so it would no longer be able to fill the mold as it's supposed to. And so I'm actually like ruining the structure if I were to keep it going at this point in time. So now we're just going to watch this rise for a little bit and kind of give you a sense of how this stuff functions. So these have now risen as much as they are going to rise, but they are not still ready to be pulled out of the mold yet. Obviously, you can see in this case they've kind of overfilled their back. If this was something that I was building for a show, I could either go ahead and slice that off so I had a flat bottom, or I can do what's called a pressure board. This is a piece of masonite that I've drilled holes in and will clamp over it, and so that forces all of this foam to go against this board and only come out where that single hole is, so it makes it easier to chop off and gives me a smooth back. One of the advantages of this foam, though, is that it will be that same color all the way through. In this case, I just did a light brown to show you what one drop would get you. But normally I'll do a swirl or some sort of other pattern to give it a little more realistic look. And in that case, then, it would have that swirl all the way through. And so if I were to slice it, I would have that same texture all, in each piece. So it is a good way of making like a big bundt cake and then slicing that into individual slices and having that look all the way through each piece. So now we're going to go ahead and make some liquid plastic chocolates. As opposed to our liquid foam that we just watched, this will be the same volume liquid as it is solid. But unlike that one, you saw the color changed a little bit as it started to foam up. This one will fairly dramatically change in color because what's going to happen is these two liquids are going to come together and they're going to go through an exothermic reaction. And after that happens, tiny little air bubbles are going to be captured inside of this. And so it's going to go through what's called the flash cure, which means that instantaneously it's going to go both from being a liquid to being a solid, but it's also going to go from being a clear amberish color to being an opaque chocolate brown color. If I were to just do these products as they are right now, it would be sort of a light beige color. This is actually the color that it would be just by itself. So I'm going to go ahead and dye it with some of our brown dye to make it look a little more like our chocolate desired. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and use 4 drops of brown dye. And again, because my working time is quite low in the pot life of this, I want to go and make sure that I get this dye as mixed in as I can. And again, I'm going to use the 2-cup mix method. So I'm going to mix it into 1 cup first, try and mix it around for about 1/3 of its pot life, and then pour it into an entirely new cup to make sure that if I have any unmixed portions, I'm not going to put those into my casting. And now I've got a little bit of time, so I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit more into a separate cup and add one extra drop of brown into that, and then kind of swirl it around together to show you what can happen if you kind of swirl things together. But they got to work very quickly because now we're going to wait for these to cure. So what's going to happen is, as I said, these are going to kind of cure from the center of their mass outwards because that's the exothermic reaction. And so what you will see is in a little bit, they're going to go kind of instantaneously a different color on the very center, and then that will work its way out to the extremities. So everywhere now where there's this lighter brown color, these are solid. But around the edges, they're still curing up. While we wait for our chocolates to finish casting before we can demold those, I want to show you my favorite thing to do with liquid plastic, and this is what we're going to basically end on today. I've got a cheap dollar store cereal bowl and a spoon. You don't want to do the prop with anything that you care about because this will permanently be bonded to the bowl itself. And then I've also got a couple of sheets of aluminum foil that I'm just going to use to kind of help support the spoon inside the bowl to kind of give it a little more realistic look. So, what I like to do first of all is kind of make a little rest for the spoon to sit in. I'm trying to basically freeform this to kind of just set the spoon up a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and use some cereal. In this case, we're going to use some Frosted Flakes. And I'm just going to fill the bowl up like I was filling it up normally with cereal. And now in the same way you've seen before, I'm going to measure out plastic, but in this case, I'm going to use a super white, super fast setting liquid plastic. So I'm using basically about 4 ounces of each part, so I'll end up with about 8 ounces of liquid in the finished bowl. I'm going to mix my part for about 1/3 of the pot life and then pour it into the new cup to make sure everything is evenly mixed. And then I want to kind of pour starting where the spoon is basically, and just kind of let it kind of flow and find its own level. And now this too will instantaneously go from being a liquid to being a solid. But again, it's going to kind of start at the center mass and work out. You can see already here where it's starting to get white, that is already solid right there. And that will keep working its way out. See here, same on this edge too. Right, it's all based on the mass. And so the bigger the mass chunk, that's where it kind of starts the curing process. And again, I'm using Smoothcast 300 Quick. This is not what I would recommend for you guys to start out with, but it is fun for this demo and allows me to kind of show this to you in real time, as well as having to wait for the demolding of other stuff. And basically this is, you know, able to be pulled out in about another minute or so. But you can see the thing that's really cool about it is that even those little bits of plastic that got onto the different flakes and stuff look like actual milk poured over it. In the meanwhile, here's our little bunt mold that we just made up. Kind of shows you what that guy looks like when it's finished casting. And same is true of our chocolates. So you can see these were the ones that we did that were just our flat solid color. And then this is that darker one that I did kind of to show you a way of marbling, which is sort of my preferred way because I think everything marbled looks a little more realistic on stage. And then finally, these were our cupcakes from before. I wanted to show you them as basically how they dried. So that's the way that coverage sort of finished off. And then these are our 3 little ones that got started. So again, you can kind of see the volume that they became as they kind of rounded out the top over each of them. So our cereal bowl is now entirely cured, and so all we need to do is pour off any loose cereal. Then we are left with this really cool looking fake bowl of cereal. And in fact, it's solid enough in there that I can hold it up by the spoon itself. So it's my favorite kind of fake food prop to make because it just works so well. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's class. I hope you guys learned some fun things and some ideas that you can take and play with at your schools. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And I will see you guys around and hope you have a good conference. See you guys later. Bye.